This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Yes, good evening. It's myself, Ben Thomas, with another Twilight Show on Tuesday from a very sunny Reading tonight, actually. My guest tonight has very good links with Reading, actually. We've got John Cosgrove on the show tonight, and we're going to be talking about the state of education in 2023.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Yes, indeed. Just in case you didn't get that from the intro, we are live on Teachers Talk Radio for the next, probably the next hour or so. Really, I've got John Cosgrove on the show. Can't wait for him to join us very, very shortly. He's a retired head teacher. I say political, that's not quite right. Education commentator, written some fantastic blogs recently. So we're going to be getting into that in just a short while. I hope you've had a really good week. It's kind of quite crazy that this is the first, or the start of the first full week that we've all worked in a while, really, with all the bank holidays and, you know, strikes and potential polling stations that your schools may or may not have been as well. So yeah, it's I already feel like it should be at least Thursday, and we're only on the end of Tuesday. Lots of things to discuss on the show tonight. We're obviously going to have the new segment. There's a lot of things circling at the moment that are in education, that are kind of circling around, that we probably need to focus on. But it's a crazy period of time for education in general, really, and it's very, very difficult to see past some of those huge issues that we're all experiencing, to be honest. And John is going to help us kind of pick through those when he joins us later on. But overall, you know, it's been an interesting start to the first part of the summer term. Really, it's kind of one of those strange things where it's you kind of get to Christmas and you feel like it's you kind of feel like the end of the year is a long way off, and actually it just circles back round, and you're back into May. Getting ready for certainly in our school, you know, the year 6 SATs that were last week, the year 2 SATs were kind of going on as well, and then of course you've got transitions to secondary schools and all the things that come with the end of the year, really, in terms of school. So it's interesting times. It's something that we're all kind of working through and doing the best we can with it, really. But it's interesting. You know, there's been a lot of news articles. But, I guess since it's kind of the strike action started up and how people were moving forward with that, really, there seems to be a lot more focus on kind of like the mainstream media on what's going on in education. And one of the things that you might have seen today, which, we're going to probably unpick a little bit more. I'd love to get John's views on that, is to do with, Nick Gibb, the schools minister, thinking about reviewing the reading paper, the SATs paper from last week. So it's kind of an interesting one for that to make mainstream media, because in the grand scheme of things, anyone involved with the SATs last week will know that it was very, very difficult, and a lot of children up and down the country struggled with it, even what we'd class as potentially good readers. But it's one of those where they've decided to kind of look at it in a bit more detail, and analyze it kind of a lot more than maybe was previously going to be the case. But on the same day, and I'll kind of read parts of this because this was an article that I had saved. The headline on Sky News is "Children's Reading Ability Compared Around the World as England Moves Up the Rankings." And this is on Sky News. This is not a secret article. It's kind of alive and exclusive on their site. The kind of the tagline is England's 9 and 10-year-old pupils have landed a top 5 place in new international rankings for reading. Based on tests which are usually carried out every 5 years, England achieved 4th place in a global education league table, following the latest progress in international reading literacy study, and that is PRLS, just in case you love an acronym. It goes on to say that Singapore gained the top spot with an average score of 587 out of 43 countries, as the reading levels of 9 and 10-year-olds were tested at the end of the school year. And what's fascinating about this is that it's almost contradictory to what seasoned educational professionals were saying last week when we had to sit the SATs paper, or our children had to sit the SATs paper. And we're not allowed to go into details until they're kind of published, which again is another farcical rule of Key Stage 2 SATs. But they were tough. There was a lot of extra words on there that wouldn't have been on previously. And actually, what our children found in our school was that they had to sift through an awful lot of language and an awful lot of questions that were, I felt designed to catch them out, really. But we're being told that actually, children sort of 9 and 10 are coming forth in the world, with their reading ages and their reading abilities, which is quite fascinating, really. The two don't quite sit, really, because it, as I said, it kind of felt like the reading SATs paper was designed to catch people out, or children out. So it's, go and have a read of that. It's not anything that's particularly groundbreaking, but it is interesting. The article goes on to say that girls are ahead of boys, or are ahead of boys in nearly every country. And that's, that's something that traditionally we've always had to deal with, particularly as primary educators. But, there's a lot more opportunity now for boys to get into reading. And I'm hoping that, moving forward, we won't compare, the kind of the sexes of children to what the other one can do. Because, reading should come from passion, right? It should come from stuff that is, intrinsically interesting to those children. We want children to pick up books, want children to read, and we want children to read for pleasure. And my kind of frustration with the SATs is that it kind of destroys that a little bit. If you think about, anyone who's done a reading teaching unit, and you kind of go through the process and you map out the skills that you want to cover in a particular text or a particular piece of writing, for example. You do a lot of the embedding first of all. You talk about the text, you analyze it, you gather opinions if you're really kind of pushing it and giving it some. And I think what SATs does is it, certainly the SATs reading paper, is it kind of puts the children on the back foot. So they're being basically forced to read something they've never come across. The context is always key. I've kind of started reading long-term reading units and picked a book, based on the kind of the list that we're given, and just within probably 10 minutes I've realised that actually it's not suitable for those children in terms of the context. So there's there's a lot of elements in terms of the reading not catering to that. I read an interesting blog, towards the end of last week, where there was someone who was suggesting that reading should be teacher assessed in the same way that we now assess writing. Obviously, I know that there is moderation attached to that from local educational authorities. And I know some of you will have had that joy, having done all the SATs on the Friday, and then be kind of given an opportunity to then be moderated. So there's a lot of issues there, really. But this blog kind of went on to talk about, we want children to have a love and an enjoyment and an engagement for writing, because that's kind of when you truly get their core skills out and their abilities kind of showing. But actually what we want to see that is reading as well. I don't think as much as we don't like doing them, the argument isn't quite the same for maths, because it should be fairly straightforward to create, 3 papers to test the ability of children, within that, within those parameters. But with reading, that I thought it was a really interesting kind of, it wasn't an argument so much, but just a kind of a statement really, in terms of actually getting them to be teacher assessed moving forward. Obviously, the flip side of that is, how do you moderate that? What evidence do you gather for reading? But actually, there's a lot to be said for, for being able to kind of moderate and teacher assess reading, rather than giving them a large SATs paper. So I thought that was a really, really interesting piece of writing, kind of a statement to make, really. And then, of course, we've got the other flip side of that is the year 2 SATs, which, we know ultimately are going, but are never kind of, I say given importance, that's not the right word, but they're not as kind of rigid as maybe the Key Stage 2 SATs are delivered. So there's a lot of kind of opposing views in education at the moment, and a lot of differences of opinion, from a whole range of topics, really. Behaviour, messages from Matt CEOs, all this kind of stuff is kind of put into the melting pot, and that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on today, really, with my guest, John Cosgrove, who I believe is here with us now live. John, are you there, sir?
I am here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. How are you?
Well, I'm fine, thank you. I'm having palpitations because I've been listening to you for the last 10 minutes and couldn't work out how to get into the room, but that's sorted now.
No problem. Well, I hope you enjoyed that kind of monologue. Is it a monologue? I don't know. 10 minutes of me wittering on. It's quite nice to kind of talk into an empty void sometimes without people disagreeing with me. So that was the point of that, really. But John, I kind of introduced you briefly, but for those people that are just joining us, and obviously yourself, you've had quite a career, really. Retired head teacher now. I would say, probably one of the most prominent education commentators there are at the moment, in terms of the articles and the blogs that you are producing. We're going to kind of focus on those a little bit more later on, but just talk to us a little bit about your career to date, because it's been quite a long one for you, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, 40 years. I started teaching. Well, I actually started in the 70s. Would you believe? That's a very long time ago. And my first teaching post, my first full-time permanent teaching post, was in a secondary school in Cornwall. In 1981, I took that post, and I taught secondary Spanish and French for 12 years. Thoroughly enjoyed that. But one of my jobs at the time, after 3 or 4 years of working in the secondary school, I got a job as primary liaison. So that was in addition to teaching, obviously. And what that meant was that I was going around the primary schools in our local area, our partner primary schools, and I was talking to the children in year 6, and they were coming to our school, and I was showing them around and so on. And I was going into primary schools and seeing what was happening in primary schools and talking to primary teachers. And as I went around, the more I was doing this, the more I was thinking, I actually really like what's happening in primary schools. I think maybe, although I was thoroughly enjoying my job, maybe primary schools might be the place for me. So I did make the jump. I made the jump in 1992, and I moved into primary schools. And I was very fortunate because I got a job as what was then called a Section 11 teacher in London. And the Section 11 were referred to a section of the Home Office, an act passed by the Home Office. And it provided for children who were in English schools, but for whom English was not their main language, to have a dedicated teacher in the school, not for every child, obviously, but a dedicated teacher in the school to help them with the adaptation to learning in the classroom. And so I was in a primary school. Actually, it was 2 schools side by side, a junior and an infant school. So I was in these two schools for about 18 months. And I had the terrific privilege of going into classes of all ages, working with, supporting, helping children of all ages from nursery up to year 6. And so I had almost, if you like, an apprenticeship in a primary school without having to take responsibility for a class. Then in 1994, the then government, the John Major government, cancelled the Section 11 programme. So the funding finished. And so I then got a job in a primary school as a year 6 teacher, again, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Moved on from there to be a deputy head back in Cornwall. And from there on to be a head teacher in Reading, which again, I've been terrifically privileged throughout my career because everything I've done, I have really enjoyed. I've enjoyed working with children. I've enjoyed working in a range of schools. I've enjoyed working with staff of all kinds and the parents who are I found very, very supportive in the main, because what they want is the best for their children. And if you're hoping to give the best to their children, if you're trying your best, then they're on your side. They will help. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed my career.
I think you used two words there. One kind of many times, but you used the word privilege, and you used the word enjoyment an awful lot, and kind of variations of that word. And I think one of the main reasons I got you on, John, is because you're not, from what I understand, you're not directly involved with any school now, but you have very, very strong views, very clear views, in my opinion, very articulate views on where education currently is. And from my point of view, I've been a teacher now for 16 years, kind of various different roles, all kind of Berkshire based, as you know, kind of very well, this area. And it strikes me, John, that the general mood of the profession at the moment is not one of privilege, is not one of enjoyment, is not one of really loving what's going on. There's a lot of passion, and there's a lot of people that are kind of sticking with it because they, in some respects, feel they have to. But would you kind of agree with the fact that there is very little enjoyment, generally speaking, in the profession at the moment?
I certainly see an awful lot of disillusion. I see an awful lot of pressure. I see teachers who are feeling under a lot of pressure and desperately unloved. And that's not just about the pay. It's about the fact that in the last 5 or 6 years, the number and the availability of teaching assistants has dropped. So working conditions for teachers at all levels have got harder. And there's a lot more pressure on schools, on teachers, to produce results, measurable results. And that has really altered the relationships, I think, and altered the job. I think it is a terrific privilege. And I think it's a terrific privilege to think that parents trust us with their children, that parents would say to me, look, here is my child. I'm going to give you my child for 5 hours every day for the next 195 days. And I trust you to help that child to grow and to develop and to learn. And I think, that is a terrific level of trust. And I think you probably still can enjoy the relationships with the children. I think you probably still can enjoy the relationships with staff. I think in schools where the senior leadership team are very clear about what they're doing and very clear about their wish to support the teachers and the teaching assistants, I think there is still enjoyment. I think there can still be a satisfaction. I'm not, as you say, involved in a school at the moment, but I've been into 2 schools recently to do a little bit of charity work. And I've also, my eldest daughter is a head teacher, and one of my sons has just got a job as a deputy head. So I know first or second hand from them and from others in my family who are still teaching in the classroom that you still can get job satisfaction despite the pressures that there are. But I've never known a time when teachers have been under such pressure and when there has been such widespread disillusion in the profession. I think it's very, very sad. And I do think, we had a government that came to power in 1997 that came to power on the mantra of education, education, education. And we've now got a government which doesn't seem to care very much at all about education. We seem to have gone completely the opposite pole. The funding isn't there, the um, care for teachers, the care for staff, the care for pupils isn't there. I mean, I really don't see the commitment from government that we have had in the past and that our children deserve.
We're going to talk, a little bit later on as we go through the show about, what you feel are the biggest issues. You kind of alluded to it there, and I'll be completely open with everybody. The main reason I got you on, John, is because I agree with pretty much everything you say, and what marks you out from other people is that you kind of, and we'll talk about the articles and the blogs that you've written later on, but you're very, very clear on what you would do, and what your suggestions would be to kind of move things forward. I just kind of want to focus back on. I'm kind of picking at threads in terms of what you were saying, and you used the word trust there, and it doesn't take someone to be incredibly clever to work out that trust is the most important part of any job, let alone education. And I've, like you, I've worked in a number of different settings and schools, and where it's worked is that there's trust between all stakeholders, whether that's parents to teachers, whether that's children to teachers, whether that's teachers to other teachers, senior leaders to TAs, whatever it is, that the trust has to be there. Why do you feel that? You kind of mentioned about the government and their kind of behaviour towards education. Why do you feel that the government in particular are not trusting of teachers at the moment? Is it kind of like has it been a big bang moment in the profession? Has it been a kind of a gradual decline of that relationship? In your opinion, John, what is the main reason for that lack of trust?
Do you know, I think that there is a view on the part of government ministers that teaching is the kind of thing that sort of anybody can do. I don't know, you won't remember this, Ben, because you're much younger than me. I'm a very old man. But back in 1992, when John Major won the general election, he had plans for a mum's army, because his idea was that volunteers would come in and would work in schools and would transform schools and would do all the teaching. And I see this attitude that anybody can teach, that you don't really need specific skills, that you don't really need to be dedicated, that it's an easy job. What is it? It's just looking after children. Anybody can do that. And I see that attitude in things like changes to the initial teacher training framework. Now, don't get me wrong, I think school direct, I think school-based teacher training can be absolutely fantastic. And I ran a consortium for school direct, but I do worry that routes into the profession from sort of an apprenticeship level, if you like, in school direct and other school-based systems, routes into the profession from those directions do not have the underpinning that you and I had from well, I didn't do a PGCE, I did a BEd, but from the PGCE or the BEd route, where you have the philosophy, you have the psychology, you have things on behavior management, you have an overarching thing about this, treating what you're doing not as a job but as a profession. And I've seen the same sort of thing in other areas. I mean, there was a proposal last week in the NHS it was floated by a government minister or by a Tory MP or somebody, saying that, no, it was a government minister, saying that we could make up for the lack of numbers of doctors by having apprentices straight out of school. They wouldn't necessarily go to medical school. They would go straight into hospitals and learn specific trades. Now, that, I think, in hospitals is a ludicrous idea, but it's actually what's been done in schools, isn't it? We have deprofessionalized the profession, if you like. And I do think that there's an attitude on the part of government that really what we do is not very difficult, it's not very important, and pretty much anybody can do it. And if we can't do it properly, then they'll get others, any Tom, Dick, or Harry, to come and do it. It's
Yeah. No,
I don't know.
I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that's a really good comparison to run it in terms of what they tried to do with doctors in the NHS. And, they as a general body, they seem to be at loggerheads with any
Yeah,
public service, really, which is bizarre,
yeah. Well,
considering that, the behaviour of how they were in the pandemic, really.
yeah, absolutely. And actually, when you think about it, the way, I mean, I wasn't in school during the pandemic, but the way the profession responded in the pandemic, and teachers were coming in and working in schools knowing that they didn't have the protections that people had in other jobs, other workplaces, other settings, but they were coming in, they were working with children, they were working throughout the pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, when we had the lockdown, teachers had to learn a whole new set of skills doing the online teaching, doing the interactive teaching, all of that teachers did. But fundamentally, the government wants to save money. And so it's not really very concerned about teachers because, as I said, there's an attitude that pretty much anybody can do this job. And I find that very, very sad. Uh, it reminds me, actually, and this is going off a tangent, a complete tangent, but my father was a head teacher, head of a secondary school. And I remember him saying to me once, talking about lunch duties, because when you do a lunch duty in school, you can claim for a duty lunch. So you can have a free lunch. Now, I don't know what school dinners cost now. It used to be about £1.90 when I was a head. But I remember him grumbling to me towards the end of his time as a head, saying, they took away from us our lunch times. We gave them away during the war for the war effort, and they've never given them back. And all they give us in place is 50 pence for a lunch. And that shows how long ago it was, because he was teaching in those days. But, there's a point to that, isn't there? That governments want to save money. And if they can get away with not giving you the rate for the job or paying properly for what you do, then they probably will.
I think it's all, we know as people kind of involved and kind of taking the pulse of what's going on, that it's all linked. You read those absolute horror stories of kind of awful instances involving children where they're kind of the aggressors in situations. I think there was one, I think probably today or over the weekend, where they had the 11-year-old and the police officer and that kind of thing. And it's all linked. It's in order to kind of at least alleviate some of those situations. Schools need to be properly backed and properly funded. And we're gonna talk about kind of like, I say a wish list, John, but things that you would change almost immediately if you were given the power to be able to do that. We're going to hear from our sponsors very briefly, and then we'll be right back on the Twilight Show with myself, Ben Thomas, and my very esteemed guest, John Cosgrove. So bear with us, and we will be back in just a few moments.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
All right, that was a message from the Happy Confident. If only the profession was happy and confident at the moment, John. That's kind of what we want to unpick with you today on the show. So, I mean, I kind of had a look, in preparation for the show, and just kind of, I don't spend a huge amount of time looking at teacher notice boards, and I say interacting with teachers. That's not quite right, because obviously I'm running this show on Teachers Talk Radio. But kind of the main things that really came out as kind of common threads, and these were in no particular order, were kind of testing. So obviously very topical at the moment with the Year 6 SATs last week, and the Year 2 SATs that are kind of ongoing, up and down the schools in the assessment window at the moment. Teacher autonomy, which has been a big thing, not just for the kind of the professional discussion, but for this radio station as well. There's been quite a few comments and shows around teacher autonomy. From a senior leadership point of view, recruitment and retention, kind of bundle those together. And generally, we kind of touched on the trust, but what's linked to that is the lack of money to be able to do the things that schools need to do from a, not even from a wish list point of view, but from a very basic point of view. Simple resources. You made a really good point about the school lunches there, but that's something else that's part of that discussion. So, for you, John, in terms of the work that you do, the people that you speak to, the schools that you go into, as you said, for the kind of the charity work, what are the kind of main issues for you in education at the moment? The kind of state of play of education in 2023, and kind of on top of that, what would you do to kind of solve those specific issues, or at least try and solve those specific issues? I know you've written some fantastic articles, which we will talk about in the latter half of the show. But in terms of those kind of those key topics, what are the main issues for you that you can see at the moment?
Well, I think the big one at the moment for everybody, I think, is proper remuneration for teachers, proper funding for schools, so that we can afford the teaching assistants, we can afford the resources, we can afford the trips, we can afford to do the best for children. So I think we should be restoring education funding, schools funding, to at least 2010 levels. In the Blair years, it went up year on year. Since 2010, it has gone down. So we do need to restore funding to previous levels. We need to look at, as I say, teacher retention and recruitment you mentioned, but remuneration for teachers is key in that, and also a reduction in workload. And that's where teaching assistants can come in. That's where proper resources come in. And that's where things like PPA come in, because, before we had PPA, it was very hit and miss whether you would get well, in primary school, you didn't get any time for assessment or marking, not in the school day. So we need to make sure that we get those entitlements, and that the job becomes attractive to people again. And that's again where, you mentioned trust. That's where trust is important. But I do think one of the biggest, really big issues in education at the moment that affects children, and that's really what schools are all about, affects children hugely, is the fragmentation of our system. We've had since 2010 a fairly incoherent policy. First, there were the free schools, then there were the single academies, then there were the incentives to encourage schools to become single academies. There was £100,000 on offer as a initial bribe at one stage, and then it was, if three schools got together and formed a multi-academy trust, then there would be £50,000 between them. So there were at different stages that there have been different iterations of the structures around schools. And what's happened is that we've got, and I'm thinking about Reading now, because you and I both know Reading very well. And in Reading, I would say...
We do.
I would say that in Reading, which is only a small local authority, I know at least half a dozen multi-academy trusts who have schools in Reading. And then there are some schools which are still local authority schools. And what that means is, in that very small geographical area, you have institutions, MATs, none of whom are responsible for all the young people in the area. And then children fall through the gap. There are, for instance, and now I'm moving outside Reading, because I'm not saying that Reading is like this, or Reading is the worst for this or anything, but nationally, there are thousands, literally thousands of children with special educational needs who have no educational provision at all. Now, that's not children who are home educated. That's children who have no educational provision at all, because they fall through the gaps, because nobody is taking responsibility for them, because the local authority, which in theory has the responsibility, doesn't have the power anymore. It can't say to schools, we need you to take these pupils, because the schools are academies. The only person who can say to them, you must take a pupil, is the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State usually chooses not to exercise that power. Another example of this is when a child moves schools. Now, I had a child in my school. Well, in fact, I had a family in my school whose parents told me that they were moving to Swindon, and they were moving to Swindon because Dad had got a new job and the housing was cheaper, and they were, they were happy to go to Swindon. So they moved 2 weeks after Easter. 2 weeks after that, the man rang me in my office in Reading, and he said, "Look, I can't get the children to school. Can you help?" And so I did ring the local authority in Swindon, but the local authority in Swindon couldn't really do anything, because what happens is when a child moves from one local authority district to another, they, during the school year, they then have to apply, if there are academy trusts in the area, they have to apply to each individual academy or school, because they're all their own individual admission authorities. So they have to apply individually to all these places, and then they have to wait for the 4 or 5 weeks or whatever it is to get a response from them. And in the end, you have children who end up missing months, literally months of education. And this is particularly iniquitous, I think. That is particularly bad for children who are in the care of local authorities. Children in the care of local authorities very often have to move from their home area. Don't get me started on why that is, because it shouldn't be, but they do. They very often have to move from their local home area. So they're taken away from their family, they're taken away from their friends, they're taken away from their relationships, all their links and so on. And then they find that they can't get into a school. And I was talking to a young man in town here. At the moment, I live in a small town in West Cornwall, which is, where I taught for many years. But I'm living in this small town in West Cornwall. And 2 Saturdays ago, I met a man in the street, and he said something that piqued my interest. And I just said, "Oh, excuse me, did you just say, I don't want to interfere, and I wasn't eavesdropping, but did you?" And it turned out, anyway, we got chatting. Very, very nice young man. He was 24. He had been in care. He was a care leaver, and he had 20 different placements. So I said to him, "Well, what happened about school?" And he said, "Well, I didn't go to school." He said, "Not really. I mean, I might have done a week here or a week there, but I didn't go to school, really." And the placements that children have, I mean, there was a report written, I wrote a couple of blogs about this a few years ago. There was a report written by the Children's Society, which was followed up by another report written by the Children's Commissioner of the time, not the present Children's Commissioner, but Anne, I've forgotten her surname. Anyway, sorry, the Children's Commissioner at the time. And they were talking about precisely this, that the Children's Society report was called Pass the Parcel, because children were being moved from one placement to another, from one local authority to another, and they effectively, according to the Children's Commissioner, many of them were not having anything like what you would expect in the way of an education. And
I mean, that's absolutely frightening, isn't it? To consider that, I believe you said he was 24 for most of his life, to not be in, a consistent school, or at least a school consistently, is quite concerning. And John, I would imagine that it still happens, and I would imagine that there are situations there, and that that system effectively plays into the hands of safeguarding issues.
Absolutely, yeah. County lines. Yeah, absolutely. These children who are not in school, and you're absolutely right, Ben. It does happen. It happens every day now. It really does still happen. But these children are prey for grooming gangs. They're prey for. They're not in school, so they've got no friends around. Their family are, in some cases, hundreds of miles away. So they are prime candidates for somebody to come and befriend them. And the county lines drug running, many of them, or not many, but some get involved in the grooming gangs that we've seen so much talk about recently. They're prime candidates for those. It's a really, really desperately sad situation. And at the same time, we are told that children in care are one of the government's priorities. They want us to close the gaps educationally. And because of the fragmentation of education, we simply cannot help these children. Another prime example of this is children who are evicted from home. Now, last year, the Shelter estimated that 120,000 children were in temporary accommodation. Now, I don't know how this has affected you in your school, but I knew in my school in Reading several families who were evicted from their homes, and they would end up in Basingstoke or Slough, sometimes further afield. They would then have the issue of getting their children to school. Now, people who've been evicted from their homes, by definition, are not the wealthiest people in the world, and sometimes they simply couldn't afford to bring the children to our school. So they would go to schools locally and apply for places, but the schools locally would put them off or would say, no, you have to wait, just like the family I told you about before who moved to Swindon. And so I have known children leave our school and be out of school for weeks or months.
Yeah, I mean, you made the point about temporary accommodation. I mean, from our point of view, and this is not exclusive to our school in Reading. There are so many children coming from overseas that are placed in hotels, which people have obviously read about in the media. And what we find is that they're given our school or other schools because of the locality of the school to where they're currently staying, and then they're kind of given more permanent accommodation, and it might be that's the other side of town, the other side of Reading, the other side of wherever they're based in the country, which then obviously affects their attendance because they've got to get they've either got to get transport that they can't afford, or they've got to walk because they can't afford the transport. So all these issues then become bound up in effectively become the school's problem. And problem's not the right word, but it's kind of the school is responsible or left to be responsible for these issues that are through no fault of the school's organisation whatsoever. And ultimately, what happens in these cases, as you know, John, is that the children suffer, the parents suffer, and then it just increases the anxiety all round, really, because of the messages from the DfE, the messages from Ofsted when schools are inspected, the messages around safeguarding. So there are so many kind of little threads that add up to such huge issues for these children, where they end up, as you say, with the guy that you gave an example of. They're not in education, and that's a real concern from every school in the country's point of view that has to experience this. You made the point earlier about local authority schools and perhaps the conflict of interest when they're run by an academy. What is your view currently on the kind of effective forced academisation of schools following certain Ofsted? What are your opinions on that at the moment, John?
I think that's disgraceful. I really do. It was one thing to say schools might opt out of local authority control. This happened. It was Michael Gove's brainchild in the present incarnation, but it happened back in the Major government as well. That some schools were able to be grant maintained. They were able to opt out of local authority control. So it's something that has happened before, and there have been schools. There are church schools. There are grammar schools, direct grant schools. That there have been schools in the past that have not been directly controlled by the local authority. That's not the big issue. The big issue here is that if a school is wanting to change its status and wanting for whatever reason to opt out of local authority control, then they and the parents will discuss it, the governors will discuss it, they'll take a view, and they'll probably go ahead with it. When you force somebody to do that, force them into a structure unwillingly that they don't particularly want, you are not only fragmenting education, as I mentioned before, which is what happens when you have all these different multi-academy trusts in a local area, but you're also creating some very unhappy and difficult relationships. People in multi-academy trusts, each multi-academy trust works slightly differently. I have known head teachers who've told me that in their particular multi-academy trust, they cannot spend more than £2,000 without the trust's approval. They can't choose their own curriculum materials. They can't employ their own staff or decide even how many staff or which staff to employ. Secondary head teachers have told me that they're not always able to run the GCSE courses or the A-level courses that they would like to run because the trust has said they can't do this or they can't do that. So that lack of autonomy is there. And if you are forced into a relationship that you haven't chosen, it is almost bound to be unhappy. Of course, when it comes as a result of something like Ofsted, then the inevitable consequence is, and I don't know of any exceptions to this, when a school changes ownership and moves from one trust to another or from local authority control to a trust, the head teacher loses their job. Some other people may lose their jobs as well, but the head teacher always loses their job. And that, I think, is pernicious. That's really, really unfair.
I mean, it fits with, the absolutely tragic events that have occurred at the start of this year. Obviously, you've written, and we are going to come to it. I know I keep teasing it, but we are going to come to the articles that you've written in the second part of the show after the news. But you were aware of Ruth Perry, who everyone knows now. She was, being Reading based, she was a very big part of Caversham, which is, if you're not quite sure on Reading, it's kind of a suburb of Reading. And this kind of pressure, this kind of expectation, this kind of deliberate agenda, I guess, in a lot of respects, it is having absolutely tragic consequences, absolutely serious consequences on, not just schools, but, then communities on top of that. And there is a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. We had them on the weekly review a couple of weeks ago. There's a school that is currently in the process of taking Ofsted to court. So there is a growing movement in education, which you've commented on really, really well, John. To kind of change the momentum, to change the expectation, to change the esteem, I guess, that the profession is held in. And for you, do you see change coming? Do you feel that we are kind of building towards something bigger to be able to kind of right some of these wrongs that have been done to the profession over the last really sort of 10 to 12 years? It's been coming for a little while, but do you see that things will change? Are you hopeful that things will change long term?
I am hopeful. I'm very hopeful. The rhetoric from Ofsted, I mean, Amanda Spielman hasn't really said anything very much in the last, well, not since she appeared on the Laura Kuenssberg programme, which was, I think, 3 weeks ago. I haven't seen any public statements from her. But what she said on the Laura Kuenssberg programme was quite interesting, because she was talking about making some changes to the appeals process for Ofsted, and about maybe allowing somebody to go with the head teacher to the feedback session from Ofsted, so that they would have somebody to talk to afterwards and somebody with whom they could discuss things and to share the pressure. So there were elements that were shifting. The initial response of Ofsted back in March, when the report on Caversham Primary was first published, and the BBC then immediately did a programme. I think they'd been waiting for the report to publish to screen this programme, and they immediately did a programme about what had happened and about Ruth's sad death. The response at that time from Ofsted was, well, everything's okay and nothing's going to change. We're happy with what we're doing. So the fact that on the Laura Kuensbo programme, Amanda Spielman was saying something slightly different, and it was only slightly different. It wasn't a big change, but it was a slight difference. It showed that there was movement. I think the next key moment will come when there's an inquest, and I don't know what the inquest will find, but I would be very surprised if there's not some link to Ofsted made by the coroner. On 10 occasions in the past, Ofsted has been cited by coroners as a factor in somebody's death by suicide. And the Leeds University researchers have discovered that the 10, I knew of about 4, but they have discovered that there were 10. Now, those have never had the effect that Ruth's death has had. They have never moved things the way Ruth's death has. They've never galvanized the profession the way Ruth's death has. And the reason for that, I think, is very simple. The reason is that that Ruth's sister, Julia, is incredibly courageous, incredibly dignified, very, very articulate, and willing to stand up and hold Ofsted to account and say this isn't good enough. When a tragic event like this happens, and has happened in the past, families have tended to close in on themselves, and they've been alone with their grief, and it has been very hard for other people to comment, to draw conclusions, to say anything. You don't want to hurt people more. The families have been hurt dreadfully, and you don't want to hurt them more by saying anything. But Julia's dignified, courageous response to her sister's death has allowed other people to draw the conclusions and to make the commentaries that really need to be made. And that's what's united the profession. And across the profession, I see lots of people, lots of things on social media, lots of blogs, lots of comments, lots of conversations that I've had with people saying, well, I thought it was just me. I thought I was the only one who felt like this. And we're discovering that actually Ofsted is having this effect on thousands and thousands and thousands of teachers and head teachers and school governors and even parents in some cases, feeling absolutely desperately destroyed by Ofsted. And so we've got a unity in the profession. We've got Ofsted beginning to move a little bit. And when I think when the inquest is held, that will be the next occasion when there will be a focus of people's concerns. And I do think there will be change. I think there will be radical change. It's also the case, of course, that there will be a new His Majesty's Chief Inspector before the end of the year. And so somebody will come in with a fresh broom, with fresh ideas. And probably, I would think, if the Secretary of State has any sense at all, will come in with a mandate to change things. So yes, I think things will change. I hope they change more quickly than at present looks likely, but I think they will change.
I think the most frustrating thing, and I've said this, really throughout my career, is that I've been through 5 full inspections, so 2-day Ofsteds in my career, and then kind of 18 months of monitoring visits, really. And some of those experiences were absolutely brilliant because the people that you were dealing with, or I was dealing with, or the school was dealing with, kind of just got it. They were educators. They knew what they'd done their research on not just the school from a results point of view, an academic point of view, but from a pastoral point of view and a social economic background, community wise point of view. But the frustration, certainly for me in education, kind of going into school every day, is that you are listening to what is essentially, in my opinion, absolute nonsense from people on these shows that have not been in education, that don't have an education background, that are just saying things that are so far-fetched, so unachievable, and so completely out of touch with what is going on in schools. That's the biggest frustration. And they are allowed to have, in some cases, an absolutely tragic effect on people that are involved in that. So yeah, I would agree with you. I hope that there is change. I think, the profession is starting to come together a little bit more than maybe it was 18 months ago in terms of moving in the right direction. But we'll see. We'll see how that pans out. We're going to head to news now, and then you'll be back with myself and my guest John Cosgrove on the Tuesday Twilight Show here in Reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
SATs have made the news again as many media outlets report on allegations that children were distraught after the reading paper. The BBC website reports that parents and teachers of Year 6 pupils said the paper was difficult and that it had left some pupils in tears. In response to concerns, the Department for Education said it worked to ensure that all tests are appropriate. Whilst some parents took to social media to highlight concerns, a few also acknowledged that the tests might be good in a way to have some kind of tests before GCSE, but the schools in general are under too much pressure to perform well. Copies of the test paper cannot be published until all pupils in Year 6 have had the chance to take it. Sarah Hannafin, Head of Policy for the National Association of Head Teachers, said the union was very concerned about the paper and it would be raising concerns with the Standards and Testing Agency. In Scotland, Edinburgh University students have criticised the institution's response to a marking boycott. According to BBC News, students fear their work will not be read as the university plans to continue awarding degrees without necessary expertise to cope with the UK-wide industrial action. The marking boycott is part of the latest phase of industrial action by members of the University and College Union at 145 institutions across the UK. Union members are refusing to undertake marking duties and assessment-related work. In response, universities are considering a number of measures, including changing marking guidelines and basing final grades on work already submitted. Many students have expressed sympathy towards staff, but also frustration that industrial action has had little impact on anyone but students, as universities have not reopened negotiations. The University of Edinburgh said it has robust measures in place to reduce the impact of industrial action and that work, including dissertations, would be read. Schools Week comment on teacher burnout after a report from Wellbeing Service Education Support shows a quarter of leaders, teachers and support staff said additional responsibilities were adding on average 4 to 6 hours to their working week. 15% of staff said they were spending an extra 7 to 10 hours supporting pupils. The collapse in support services feeding into schools, including creaking mental health support and overwhelmed SEND services, has left schools and their staff struggling to cope. Jeff Barton, General Secretary of School Leaders Union ASCL, said schools had become the de facto and unofficial branch of social and healthcare services, but that a lack of training, resources or capacity was putting staff under considerable workload stress. The most common additional responsibilities included offering pupils and colleagues emotional support and dealing with difficult pupil behaviour. More than 1/4 of staff surveyed said they had prepared food for pupils who didn't have any, and 41% said they had purchased supplies such as pens, paper and school bags. In the same YouGov survey, 2/3 of school staff said public bodies such as CAMHS and social services had been unable to offer pupils support. Further details of the findings can be found on the Schools Week website. The Guardian reported on a proposal to recruit school leavers into healthcare service apprenticeships, which would allow tens of thousands of doctors and nurses to train on the job. The NHS workforce plan could see up to 1 in 10 doctors and 1/3 of student nurses train through this vocational path in coming years. The alternative route would circumvent the standard undergraduate or graduate route. The plans have been met with criticism by unions, but Amanda Pritchard, Chief Executive of NHS England, has been speaking to pupils at a North East comprehensive school, where she encouraged pupils to earn while they learn, and highlighted the 350 different roles available within the NHS. Finally, in Wales, the BBC reports that the increasing cost of food means school caterers are struggling to deliver on the Welsh Government plan for universal free school meals. The unit price was set with an assumption about possible cost increases, but Education Minister Jeremy Miles said the world has obviously moved on and a further review was needed. The current rate of around £2.90 per child in a primary school is being described as no longer viable, as price increases of 20% on items like milk, cheese, fruit and vegetables take their toll. The Universal Free School Meals Plan is being rolled out in phases to all primary schools, although a target for every child in reception Year 1 and Year 2 to be offered a free school meal by April has been missed. The policy has been welcomed, but challenges needed to be acknowledged. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I've been searching for crazy technology. The tech I found ranges from rather funny to actually quite useful. Let's see if I can blow your mind. Everyone has probably used Google Translate at some point, even if it's just to translate a word into another language and back again to see if it changes. Well, the Google Pixel earbuds paired with the Pixel phone allow you to switch on conversation mode. Now what is being said to you in a foreign language is translated into your earbuds in real time. What you say is translated and projected via your phone. You do need an Android 6.0 or higher to do this, but this has potential to be a game changer for communicating not only when travelling, but in hospitality too. Next up is a quirkier invention, Smarty Pans. There aren't many things you can't connect to an app, and the frying pan is now joining the club. The Smarty Pan has a built-in scale to weigh your food as you add it to the pan, a handle that tells you when the pan is at temperature, and the app guides you through how to cook a meal you're preparing. Also, the nutritional content of your meal is calculated by the app. There's no advertised price for this pan yet, but keep your eyes peeled. It replaces a cookbook, reading the nutrition on a packet, and your kitchen scales, as long as you fry everything. My final crazy technology is the HushMe. This is an invention for those concerned about being overheard by others when talking on their phone or other connected devices. It works by muffling your voice so others can't hear you, keeping private conversations private. Genius, I hear you say. I need one so I can work during my commute. Before you break out the credit card, it is a rather chunky device you wrap around your whole head. I'd describe it as a pair of large headphones that connect to a cup to cover your mouth. At just over £180 and making you look like Darth Vader, you may want to do a bit of research first. Do you know of any crazy tech? Do you own any? As always, why not get in touch at TT Radio Official? I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Yes, indeed. That was the news here on Teachers Talk Radio. You were back live with myself, Ben Thomas, and my guest, John Cosgrove. In the first part of the show, we were talking kind of what the key issues really for John were in the current state of play of education in 2023, and kind of building on that theme. John has well, I mean, he's written lots of articles over the years, but the two most prominent ones recently. The first one is the cruelties of Ofsted, and the second one I've got them here. It's called Seize the Moment. Now, obviously, we don't want to make this into a solely Ofsted focused podcast, because there's been so much written, so much energy put into discussing what has been said around that. But ultimately, the kind of the narrative around the change that's needed, and the narrative around what's going to happen moving forward is a really interesting one. And before the news, John kind of told us what he felt was going to happen moving forward. The article really, John, that I want to focus on is Seize the Moment, if that's okay with you. And the reason for that is there are so many people that have got all these fantastic ideas, and that's great. We love ideas. I think in order to be a good teacher, you need to be able to learn and listen to to different perspectives on a regular basis to inform your own practice. But one of the things that you do that, in my opinion, marks you out from other education commentators is you've got plans, you've got ideas. And I said before the news, my main frustration is that people like you, people that have done the job for many years, people that have got a lot of experience, regardless of what position they held, aren't consulted and they're not listened to. And that really is a big problem, because you need the past, in my opinion, to be able to define what happens in the future. Whether that's from a bad experience or a good experience in the past, we need that experience and expertise to be able to move, the profession forward, really. And I kind of, if you've not read the article, please go out and do it. It's on WordPress. If you just Google John Cosgrove, they're going to be there. But this article sees the moment. What was the kind of inspiration for writing that? Where did you get the kind of idea to go, I'm going to put pen to paper, I'm going to come up with these, I think it's six different steps. What led you to write that, basically, John?
Well, I think we were talking before the news about the possibility of movement from Ofsted and the visible movement in Amanda Spielman's comments from before Easter up to her interview with Laura Koonsberg just a couple of weeks ago. And there was movement. The huge number, I mean, something like 4,000 teachers and senior leaders have responded to the survey run by ICT at Mr. P, and have given first-hand accounts. I've also read dozens of blogs on the same context, and all these, the first-hand accounts on the survey run by ICT Mr. P and the blogs that I've read, are all people giving their first-hand experiences of poor experiences with Ofsted. And I will say, and I must say, and you said it earlier, Ben, and it's absolutely right, I have known some fantastic Ofsted inspectors. I have known Ofsted inspectors who've been really, really helpful. And I was inspected myself I was actually a deputy the first time I was inspected. So as a senior leader, as a deputy and a head, I've been inspected 9 times under different frameworks. And most of those occasions were extremely good experiences, extremely helpful. But the problem is that the one or the two that aren't can really destroy careers, can end careers, and in some tragic cases can end lives. They damage schools, they damage children. And what these accounts that were being given on the survey run by ICT Mr. P and the I'm saying it like that, by the way, ICT Mr. P, because if you look on Facebook or on Twitter and go for ICT Mr. P, you'll find this survey there, and you'll see the thousands of accounts, the first-hand accounts. But what those accounts, what the blogs that I've read were telling everybody, was that there is an awful lot of upset, emotion, anxiety. There's a lot of real anger in the teaching profession about Ofsted. The pressure that preparing for Ofsted, waiting for Ofsted puts on people, the pressure that poor Ofsted judgments put on people, the pressure that senior leaders who in turn feel under pressure from Ofsted put on people. All of this is fueling what we were talking about before about the recruitment and retention crisis. It's making teaching a much less enjoyable occupation than it should be. So there's a lot of anger around and a lot of emotion around. And I began to see people saying, well, what we should do is this, and coming up with quite detailed plans of how Ofsted should be replaced. Then other people were saying, well, actually, what we should do is we should not replace Ofsted, but maybe we should tweak it and do this slightly differently and that slightly differently. And The NEU sponsored an inquiry, which is being led by Jim Knight, a former schools minister in the Labour government, which will set out their plans for how they would replace Ofsted. And I was beginning to see all around people coming out with, we need to replace Ofsted with this and with that. And the trouble with that is all of these are fantastic. It's fantastic that people are thinking about it. They're thinking about a future where Ofsted is different. They're recognizing that that is a real possibility now. But the problem with this is that if you go down too many disparate routes, if you say, we have a model and somebody else says we have a model and somebody else says we have a model for replacing Ofsted, and they're all different, then we're going to end up with something that Ofsted itself and the Department for Education can say, well, you can't agree on what you want, so we'll carry on as we are. And so it's a recipe for no change. It comes back to, I was talking before about fragmentation. We have a profession which I think it's unprecedented in my time as a teacher, has been united around a single issue. Maybe not unprecedented. Maybe there have been issues in the past, like the Free School Meals campaign and so on. But this certainly is a very rare moment where the profession is united, it's angry, it's desperate for change. And so I thought, well, what is it that people want? We do need a regulator. We absolutely do. We're spending public money. And I talked before about the privilege and the trust that parents put in us, that society puts in us, the privilege of working with children. We need to be sure that children are getting the best deal they can. So we need a regulator. But what I've discovered reading all these accounts is that what most people want is a regulator that we can guarantee, that we can be sure will be fair, that will treat people with respect, will treat teachers with respect. I find it absolutely incomprehensible that an Ofsted inspector would put their hands up in front of a head teacher's face and say, stop talking, I don't want to listen to you. Now, if a child did that in the classroom, you would tell them how rude it was. For one professional to do it to another and to a school leader is absolutely incredible. But I have read accounts where this has happened. So we need a regulator that treats us with respect. We need a regulator that is knowledgeable and supportive. And we need... Sorry, go on.
No, I mean, I was going to say, one of the key points about this, and we said this right at the start, and you brought it up actually, John, was the word trust. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of, and I'm not going to read everything you've said here, but in terms of the 6 points, and obviously I know you know them, John, but some people listening might not have read the article just yet. But, you say abolish overall judgments. I think we can all agree on that one, because labels don't help anyone. We're always very, very clear that labels don't help children. That's been something that's gone on for many, many years. So why do it to a school? Set up an independent, fair appeals process. I'd counterpoint that by saying if the process is fair to start with, then we probably wouldn't need an appeals process. But it's a good point to chuck in, given that, as you say, there's going to need to be, a state of flux between the different way forwards that people come up with. Remove safeguarding from Ofsted inspections. Stop insisting, and this for me was the key one, stop insisting that head teachers or senior managers must keep the result of inspections to themselves until the report is published. It's a little bit like when you do SATs and you have to cover the displays that full well that the children haven't looked at for the last 3 or 4 months. It's one of those scenarios, really. And then number 5, set up an independent review of the arrangements for inspecting schools and other educational settings. And then 6 basically sums it all up. While awaiting the outcome of this review, pause all inspections unless and until the changes listed in points 1 to 4 are made. And you made the point when we started talking about this that it is absolutely foolish to have all these different groups going off in different directions and saying, well, this is what we need this, we need that. They're utterly pointless if we're not going to get consensus on the way forward. And my big thing, reading what you've written, not just in this article, but generally, reading other people's kind of comments as well, is that whoever is inspecting schools has to be an expert in the education field, and that doesn't necessarily mean, being a head teacher, a senior leader, but someone who has been in a range of schools for a minimum period of time.
Yeah,
and having the authority to say, well, in my experience, this is what happened. I can see what this school is trying to do. They need to do X, Y, Z to improve it or to maintain it or whatever. Having people rooted in education to assess what is going on in education, for me, is the one change. If I could only have one, would be the one change that I would expect to see. And I think, in terms of the other points that you've made in Seize the Moment, it's very, very timely. And I think, well, I would encourage people to go out and read this article, because there is, John kind of paints a really clear picture of what needs to happen moving forward. And my only hope really is that people like John, other people that are involved in education for a long period of time are consulted in these changes properly, and that they actually ask schools to feed back on that process. I know that's a massive job. It's going to have to be a massive job, because we can't continue where we are. But the changes need to happen. And this seems like a good starting point for me.
Well, thank you, Ben. I mean, that's kind of you to say that. That's kind. I do think when we get to the stage of having an independent review, and I think we need to have an independent review, we need to take in all these views. And as I said before, I think it's great that people are thinking about and imagining a world post Ofsted and how Ofsted might be changed. But as you've absolutely correctly said, if everybody's going off in different directions, it's self-defeating. It won't help. It won't allow us to make the changes that are needed. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, absolutely not a problem at all. We're gonna have one final comment from our sponsors, and then we'll be right back to close the show.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
You are back live with myself, Ben Thomas, on the Tuesday Twilight Show with my guest, John Cosgrove. If you're just joining us, where have you been? We've had a really long discussion about the key points in education at the moment, and to kind of wrap it all up and close out the show. And this is quite a big question, John. So bear with me, but people are looking for leadership. Not just in their schools, but in their local education authorities, in their MATs, in their county councils, in their government, really. For anyone who is finding it difficult at the moment to do their job, I wouldn't use the word effectively, because that looks different in a lot of different settings, but we talked at the start about enjoyment, about trust, about privilege. For anyone who is not kind of feeling those things at the moment, what advice would you give to those people that are potentially struggling with the role at the moment? What kind of things would you say to them right now?
I think everybody needs somebody, a peer, a colleague, somebody that they can really talk to, and really close colleagues, close confidants, really do help in those kind of situations. You probably know where my school is, and you will know that, or my school was. It's not my school anymore. It never was in the sense that I owned it, but it was the school I worked in, and you probably know where it is. But for those who don't, there is a road, a cul-de-sac, and our school was on the north side of the cul-de-sac, and on the south side of the cul-de-sac there were two other schools, a junior and an infant school. And the head teacher of the junior school became a very, very close personal friend, very close. Lovely, lovely man. And I used to ring him up, and say, "Oh, God, you'll never guess what's happened now." And he would ring me up, and we would meet outside of school. And I do think it is important. Head teachers need to go to their cluster meetings and need to share with each other, not in the sense of going around and saying my school's better than yours, or I've got this and I've got that, and so, but going around and actually saying, that this isn't going well. How do you do this? How do you do that? And sharing like that, colleagues generously supporting each other. They don't even have to be people in the same mat, just people who understand the pressures of the job, I think is really, really important. I wrote a book years ago about stress in education. It's out of date now, and I don't recommend anybody to buy it, because last time I looked, even the Kindle version was something like 39 quid, which I find absolutely iniquitous. But anyway, I wrote a book about stress and pressures in education. And one of the things that really does help with pressure, with stress, is sharing it. And you can always tell when somebody's under stress. Again, going back to the book, one of the things in the research I did for writing it, one of the things I found was all these experiments that had been done in the 40s and 50s with stress and the effects of it. And one of the things that I will always remember is the series of experiments done where rats were deliberately stressed out. They were deliberately put under intolerable pressure. And one of the things they found in this was they did all sorts of experiments having placed these rats under intolerable pressure. But one of the things they found was that if you gave a big rat a small rat to bite, then the big rat wasn't stressed anymore. So that's a process that you sometimes see in schools, that people are under so much pressure that they will be very aggressive towards others in the school, whether it be other staff or pupils or whatever. The way of avoiding that toxic stress, that toxic pressure, is actually to share with each other, to share as equals, to talk to people, and to recognize that you're not on your own. One of the things that I find most sad about Ruth and her tragic death is that she had been told, as we are all told as school leaders after Ofsted has left, they tell you, you must not share the results of our conclusions, our verdict, until the report is published. And in Ruth's case, that was months. It went from November through December and into January. And that lack of sharing, if she had had somebody that she could have really talked to as an equal, I think she shared with her sister, but her sister wasn't a teacher and wasn't working in schools. If she could have just offloaded to somebody who she knew really would understand, if they could have talked about it, well, what does this mean, and so on, that gives you the safety valve. And it's really, really important to have that safety valve. I don't know if that makes much sense.
No, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I was fascinated listening to you really about, sharing and kind of stress levels, because actually there is, and I had this conversation with someone who is a teacher in our school today, and I I always think, now, what's the worst case scenario in this?
Mm-hmm.
What is the worst thing that's going to happen? And invariably, the worst case is that you're going to fall out with someone and you're going to have to go and look for another job, of which at the moment, luckily, there are plenty. It doesn't instantly make you a bad educator or a bad educational professional, whatever. But actually, there is a reluctance and a fear there to show vulnerability. And what you said about, your experiences in terms of having someone, physically near you, but in a different school, there isn't enough opportunity, I guess, for collaboration and for sharing and for problem solving. That's what teachers do. They make more decisions a day than brain surgeons do. That's Google it. It's a fact. I can't remember how many it is, but it's ridiculous. And teachers, by their very nature, and educational professionals by their very nature, are problem solvers. That's what they want to do. And kind of work through particular issues. And when people aren't given the options to do that, stress builds. there's then emotional reactions and so on. So I think you're absolutely spot on, and that's a great piece of advice, really. And just as we would say to anyone who's struggling, just talk about it. Share the problem. They might not be able to solve it straight away, but you've then got an outlet to do that. So I think that's fantastic advice, and I just hope that people listening to this, kind of listen to what you've said, really, and kind of take that on board and do it. So yeah, it really is so vital that there are people that can help you, and kind of develop those personal and professional relationships, really, which is vital. We are incredibly, John, we've been talking for nearly an hour and a half now, so we're almost out of time. John, thank you so much for giving up your time and coming to talk to me today, and kind of sharing your wisdom, really. Have you enjoyed being on the show?
I have. Thank you very much, and thank you for being so understanding about the technical issues last week and me being a bit late this week. I mean, I'm a bit of a Neanderthal as far as technology is concerned. I'm not very good with it, so I have eventually made it work, and I have enjoyed this evening. Thank you, and thank you for your kind comments and your thoughts and ideas and probing questions as well. Thank you very much.
No problem, John. It's been an absolute pleasure to it's been a long time coming having you on the show, but thank you so much for coming on. And if you want to hear more from John, he's on Twitter. Just type in John Cosgrove. He's on there. Lots of interesting articles that he puts up. Lots of good retweets as well, and lots of really, for me personally, really, really good comments that resonate with kind of how I'm feeling at the moment. And it goes back to the fundamental principle that we talked about at the start, that the teaching profession is about trust, it's about privilege, and it's about enjoyment, and those things really for me, and as John has said, are absolutely pivotal to what we've been doing, really. Thank you so much for listening. We will be back. I think we're back next week. Actually, I've got a science teacher on next week. It'd be quite interesting to talk to them about what they do day to day. If you missed any part of the show, it's available on wherever you get your podcast from. So just type in Teacher Talk Radio and Ben Thomas, and you can hear the whole thing back, and you'll see all the rest of the shows there. Thank you to my guest, John Cosgrove. Have a really good rest of the week, and we will see you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.
Thank you, Ben.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.